Hello again, and thank you for staying with us. We continue here. While BRICS may have been far from competing with the International Monetary Fund or challenging the hegemony of the US dollar, the recent summit showcased clear evidence of its growth, also its expansion. Leaders of emerging economies discussed details regarding alternative payment and trade mechanisms which are intended to circumvent Western-dominated systems. The 16th summit in Kazan reflects the bloc's growing global influence and also its strategic pursuit of broader economic and political cooperation. Let's unpack this further as we're joined by Redge Nkosi, who's the Executive Director at Firstsource Money. Reg, good to have you on the program this evening. Firstly, how do you see the BRICS alliance really evolving in response to these shared grievances, if you will, with Western powers? And what implications does this have for global governance?
Thanks for having me. Firstly, I think the formation of the BRICS had nothing to do with the so-called shared grievances against the West. It was just about introducing a system of fair international trade and finance among countries that wanted to do that. And that, I think, is important, given the dominance of the US dollar and the Western powers in the field of international trade and finance. So we expect that this is going to continue quite favorably for those countries that want to have a fair trade, commerce among countries. And the BRICS does indeed form that grouping that I think will enhance these prospects. So it shouldn't certainly be seen as a counterweight to the US. However, because of the recent challenges in the US, political schemes, now it is being seen as a counterweight to that. But global governance, nonetheless, is going to evolve, as it has been evolving right across time. Today, we see the gravity of economic power shifting to Asia or the global south. So governance will certainly be in the hands of countries in the global south. There's no doubt. Yeah. And that should be exciting going forward, given the fact that for almost 100 years or so, the West has been dominating, and perhaps their interests were the ones that were being served, not the interests of the global south countries.
Also mentioned in my intro are articles mentioning the establishment of alternative payment and trade mechanisms. Can you elaborate on what these might look like and how they could affect global trade?
Yeah, firstly, let me just give you an example. If you're trading with Botswana, for example, or even Tanzania, or any other country for that matter, you invoice in the US dollar. And there's a cost to invoicing your trade, your invoice, your commerce with, or using a third currency. That lots of costs, some of which are exchange rate costs, some are political costs, risks are involved in there. So what's happening today is that when you invoice Botswana or Tanzania or any other country, you invoice them in rands, you get rands. You don't have to get the US dollar. There's no need for that. So that's what's going to be happening going forward with the current payment system. In other words, I can trade with Egypt and get my rands without having to be affected by the American system, which if, for example, I have a challenge with them, they would prohibit or impinge on my freedom of trade with Egypt. Now that this is going to be taking place in local currencies, it's not only going to be very cheap, but it liberates countries from the yoke of slavery that we've seen come as a consequence of using the US dollar, the euro, and some other currencies which are third in this operation. So we should welcome this development. I think it's very important, and that does assist, I think, in growing our economies, but also easily communicating with countries that we want to trade with.
But Mr. Nkosi, with fears of Western sanctions looming, how can BRICS nations actually build economic resilience against such pressure?
Well, firstly, if we look at the sanctions regimes that have been imposed on countries, Russia is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. But if you look at it, Russia is going to be growing at about 4% GDP in the next, this year, 2024. The countries that sanctioned Russia, which is the EU as a whole, or the Eurozone as a whole, and the US are actually suffering. So sanctions do not necessarily work, and they thought sanctions are going to work. I do not think the US and the EU are going to have the nerve to sanction BRICS countries. If they do that, that would be the end of the economies. The economies are already declining. To the extent that these economies are declining, any act that may jeopardize their economies should certainly be avoided by these economies. So BRICS cannot be sanctioned as a group by any grouping at all, including the US itself. So we should stay still and think that these acts of financial and monetary sanctions, either by the US or the EU, won't be able to affect the BRICS in any way, because that will backfire quite strongly, and that the economies of the West will suffer most than the BRICS.
In preparing for this interview, another report also suggests that BRICS is not yet a challenge to the US dollar's supremacy, if you will. What steps could the alliance take to then shift the current dynamics of global currency use?
I remember in the 1930s, 1940s, people were mentioning that, well, the US is not a threat to the pound. We used to use the pound. That was the global currency then. It emerged that the US used its political power to quickly usurp the pound as the global currency. Today, the BRICS can, if they so wished, usurp the US as a global currency. Now, to say that the US will remain dominant is indeed correct. Correct to the extent that the BRICS do not want to suddenly push the US dollar out of the way. I think the idea is not about doing that. The idea is to ensure that the BRICS currencies should be used in international trade, and that allows countries to trade freely and not impinge on each other. I think that going forward, this will be interesting, knowing that, of course, these currencies are going to be stronger and stronger. But quite frankly, the US dollar is going to be declining in its use. There's no doubt about that, even if we do see that, as of now, it remains a powerful single currency of reserve that we know.
As we've seen in recent years, the BRICS formation continues to grow, with, for instance, Iran being named one of the new members. How do you think the addition of these new members to the BRICS formation will indeed impact its influence, but also its decision-making processes?
Well, decision-making processes shouldn't be problematic. There are ways in which, if a group of 10 can make decisions quite easily, just as much as there were a group of 20 or 24 with G77, for example, and decisions get made quite easily. So I do not think that should certainly be a worry that we should focus on. But if we look at the joining of countries like Iran, the US or the West have actually described Iran as a malign force. In other words, a country that they do not want, just because Iran is objecting to the whims of the US and the EU. But for the BRICS, the joining of Iran into the ranks of this group is important, is a very important power in the Middle East, and is likely to shape the dynamics in that region. Therefore, its presence in the BRICS will help stabilize the region, in my view, but also continue to contribute quite meaningfully to international order and indeed commerce as well.
Yeah. Reg, as we begin winding down our conversation, let's speak about the BRICS New Development Bank. How does the financial capacity of this bank compare to institutions, for instance, like the World Bank? And what challenges does it face in scaling its operations as well?
Firstly, I don't think it faces many challenges in scaling operations. We're looking at quite a number of countries wanting to pour money into the BRICS Bank, or the New Development Bank, that's the official name. This BRICS Bank is fairly small compared to the World Bank. There's no doubt about that. But the World Bank isn't that big. Remember, the China Development Bank is so many times bigger than the World Bank.
Yeah.
And it is possible, therefore, that the BRICS Bank would, in fact, be bigger in the next coming few years. It all depends on the members of the BRICS. If they so wish to pump a lot of money into that, this bank is likely to challenge the World Bank quite easily, and at times even challenge the IMF itself. Now, the IMF has got $1 trillion fund, and we are already about $100 billion. That's not big, but if the BRICS countries like China, India, South Africa, and many others want this bank to grow, they can easily surpass the IMF easily surpass the World Bank. There is financial muscle in the global south, and it is a question of time and political will for these countries to boost up the BRICS bank.
But Reg, given the differing agendas of BRICS members, how can a consensus be achieved, especially on joint initiatives, also especially when the individual national interests may conflict at times?
I'm aware that the UK's interests are not the same as France, just as the UK's interests are not the same of the US. So we should expect interests of BRICS countries to differ. Quite frankly, that shouldn't be the problem. The problem is, can they arrive mutually, on a decision that is of mutual interest? There will always be differing agendas, there's no doubt. I think the idea that these countries are coming together, they have seen that they have quite a number of common issues which can be solved quite easily. So it shouldn't be a challenge that we have so many countries coming up into the BRICS, and we're thinking that, the decision-making capacities want to be problematic. I don't think that. We have, like I said, area G77, 77 countries. The UN itself has got over 200 countries, but decisions get made. So that should not be seen as a challenge for BRICS, just as much as it shouldn't be seen as a challenge for any other formation. There are ways in which governance can work and decisions can be made in a very fast and effective way. I think this is not a challenge for BRICS, in my opinion.
Let's speak about, developing nations as well, such as South Africa. What opportunities do you see, especially for nations who are developing within the BRICS framework, and also in terms of infrastructure development, but the financial support that they may get from this?
Firstly, let's go back to the BRICS Bank. South Africa has got a loan from the BRICS Bank at a rate that is far lower than the money South Africa got from the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. What this means is that you can build your infrastructure at a lowered cost. That translates into an economy that's growing, but the cost of doing business, the cost of living is also lowered. So these countries in the BRICS are likely to achieve significant development as a consequence of being in this group and operating, through these institutions that the BRICS are making. I should find this development of interest to any country that seeks better development terms, given the fact that there's not much rivalry in the BRICS, and the BRICS is there for common development, I think, unlike the West, which is there for purposes of exploiting Africa and the global South. I think we should celebrate that we're in the BRICS. South Africa is going to reap quite extensively going forward. But again, this is a project of the century. South Africa will have to look forward, not just today, about what it may gain from the BRICS, not just South Africa, or other members, shared issues that they may have to solve. I think we're in a moment that is epochal, and to the extent that this is epochal, we should welcome it. And it's a new epoch indeed for countries in the global South.